Well, hello. I hope you can hear me streaming and you can hear what's going on here. This is the first time I'm doing this type of video just from my computer, my movie maker. So I'm not streaming this live anywhere. I'm just going to put this on my website. This is really the second part of the introduction video that I did. The first part was just explaining who I am and what I'm doing and sort of a little bit of background on my story, why I wrote my books, and speak publicly about child abuse and about my own story. So I thought I'd do a series of videos really going into a little bit more detail, a little bit more background information so that when people are listening to my audios or looking at my work, they'll be able to sort of see, where I'm coming from and why I've decided to go and what decisions really were behind what I've done for the last few years, especially dealing with my healing journey. And so hopefully this will be helpful. And I'm hoping that survivors, of abuse, if you're listening to my stuff, that you'll be in a safe place when you're listening because my information can trigger people. Things that I'm talking about can trigger survivors, can, cause people to regress in their healing journey. I just want people to be in a safe place when you're listening to my stuff and make sure that, that you're comfortable hearing about abuse or someone else's story and hearing about things that may trigger you. You want to be very careful and know where you are at in your healing journey before you listen to my stuff. And I've put a warning on there under a disclaimer warning section because it's really important for your healing journey. You want to be in a safe place before you listen to any of my stuff. And for minors, anybody under the age of like 18, please have an adult listen to the show with you. That sounds kind of silly, but I'm all about child protection, child safety, and anybody who's under the age of 18. I just ask you think carefully about listening to my stuff. If you're really young, I say under the age of 16, make sure you have an adult listen to them first. Make sure it's age appropriate for you because I'm talking about a lot of, very difficult subjects, child abuse. Child abuse is a very sensitive subject, for most people. I think most people find the topics of child abuse very disturbing. For me, it was my life. That's how I grew up, disturbed, in a very disturbing situation. So I can deal with this stuff and look at it and face it and talk about it. But a lot of people find this information makes them very nervous and can be upsetting for people. I'm not going to talk too much about go into too many details that are vulgar or too sensitive for the air. I just normally don't. But I am just going to discuss a little bit, about a little bit more background information about why I titled this "Born in Hell." And just to give people a little bit of an idea why a person would say they were born in hell, you know. And I mean, I'm not the only one. That's why I say I just want to be one more voice out here, really, for other people whose voices have been silenced, and who can't speak out, who can't tell their story, who cannot get help, for whatever reason, horrific situations. I just want to be one more voice out here because all of our voices are very important and they do matter and you do count. They do count. I count, and my voice counts. And so I thought, why am I not speaking up about this? I know all firsthand about all this stuff. Why am I not speaking out against this stuff and speaking up for survivors? And I thought, I know all about this, and I'll tell my story so that people will understand where I'm coming from, and that I do know what I'm talking about. And it's a horrific situation for so many people out there and so many children. So this is why I do what I do. So today I wanted to look at. I'm actually starting. I'm going to go from like different periods of my life. I'm going to go from birth really from 0 to like the first 5 years of my life. I titled this "Born in Hell" because really I was born into my parents' hell. My parents were the ones who were responsible for the hell that I was brought up in, and all the responsibility lies with them. I don't put any responsibility on the neighbors and the people that should have seen and should have known what was going on. I don't put the responsibility on the child welfare system and child services and stuff like that because, the people that were responsible for the abuse that we suffered in our home was my mother and my dad, the two adults in the situation who made extremely bad, poor choices on how they were going to deal with their problems and how they were going to deal with their life. And in doing so, set up a whole world of hell for their children. A whole lot of psychological damage, a whole lot of, just emotional damage, emotional trauma, psychological trauma, physical trauma. It was really a life hell in living with those two people, my parents. And I know my siblings would actually agree with that if they were here sitting here today. Um, you know, what caused it? My parents before, I've talked a lot about this, but my parents were both abused. My dad, I'm sure, was psychologically abused. I think he grew up in a very psychologically, mentally ill family situation where I think there was a lot of emotional problems, a lot of dealing with that kind of stuff. I don't know if he was so much physically abused. I think he was definitely mentally traumatized and probably psychologically traumatized by his mother and maybe by his dad too. It's hard to say. I didn't know my grandparents. My parents moved from Canada down to the States after well, actually 5 years before I was born. So I was born down in the States. I'm the only one that was born in the States. And all of my siblings and my parents come from Canada, different places. My parents were born in Nova Scotia, and my siblings were born all over the place. So wherever my dad was stationed, he was in the DOT, Department of Transport, in World War II. So he was in the military, basically. And they moved around quite a bit. And so he, for some reason, wanted to go to New Mexico. But they grew up in this abusive home. My mother was physically abused as a child. She was emotionally abused, verbally battered. I mean, my grandmother, as far as I know, was a horrible person. She might have been nice to some people. She wasn't very nice to her children or to some orphans that she took in from down the road. She treated children horribly. This was during the Depression. My dad was born in 1923, and my mom was born in 1927. They grew up in the Depression and on a farm and in a farming community in Nova Scotia. So there was poverty. There was a lot of, they had their the parents, my grandparents had land. So they weren't really poor. They had land and they were able to hold on to their land. They didn't have a lot of extras, and I think the children were looked at as just kind of work hands, right, to work the farms. And in my dad's case, I just think it was an abandonment situation because his dad moved out because he supposedly had TB and he moved to a cabin. But there's two conflicting reports. And one was that his dad wanted to be a professional piano player and didn't want the kids around uh, to bother him while he was playing piano, so he moved out. I don't know, but there's a lot of weirdness going on my dad's side. But my mom's side, I kind of know the story because my mother would tell me these things about the things that happened in her family when she was growing up, and this bad relationship that she had with her mother, who was very physically violent with her children, very physically abusive, killed one of her own sons, not by murder, but by what she did to him, and then he died because of the abuse that he suffered. He was a teenager. She had beaten him and then put him out in the barn to sleep in the barn. It was cold, and he died from, I guess, exposure or whatever you want to call it. He was like beaten up, and he just died of pneumonia or whatever. So my mother, her relationship with her own mother, my grandmother, was not very good. My grandmother was horrible to her children as well as to the orphans that she took in from down the road, except for this one little orphan who she took in from across the street, who she doted on. And so really very bizarre behaviors. My grandmother was probably mentally ill. I wouldn't doubt that. And I met her a couple of times. I didn't like her at all, and I didn't have anything to do with her. She did come stay with us for off and on over a couple of 2 times for a few months. So I did get to know her. I didn't like her at all. And you know, so my mother had this strange relationship with her own mother, right? I don't think there was any kind of care or compassion or anything like that shown to my mother. So when my mother had all these children, I don't think she knew how to do that. It wasn't ingrained in her. You'd think a person could just know this, that when you have a baby and you have a child, you have to have this bonding period. The nurturing and the love has to come from somewhere, right? And so that's this mother-child bond. And for my mother, it just wasn't there. My mother was bitter, a bitter, bitter, extremely bitter woman. But she was also a very good manipulator as well. Both of my parents were very, very good at manipulating people. And before, when they had friends, even back when my mom would tell me when they were living in Canada, they had all kinds of friends, my dad especially, because he was in the DOT. And, they would hang around with these people, and then they'd go home, and then the abuse would start. My dad would be abusing the kids, my older siblings, or, I heard a few stories from my older siblings, but they don't never really talked about it too much. And my parents would fight, and then there was always a problem with money. My dad would withhold money. He wouldn't buy food, he'd buy furniture. So my mom said they were eating like one potato to share between her and the children. Which shows, so in other words, my mom left this abusive woman, her mother, just to get out of this abusive environment. At the age of 20, married my dad, who was who had already kind of been abusing her premaritally before they were even married. He was verbally abusive. He was running her down. I don't know why she married him, probably just to get out of her mother's house, right? Because this was back in like the 40s. You didn't go off and move off by yourself as a woman in Canada. So, that old way of thinking. So, yes, it was a horrible situation. So my mom married my dad, and he just thought that he could just do whatever he wanted to his wife and to his children. He just thought that's just, you have to be a man. He was in the military. You got to be tough. You got to be, tough love. You got to bring up your kids with a stick and the belt, and you got to whip them into shape. That whole corporal punishment thing. My mother was also into that, right? But they would beat on each other. My dad would beat on my mother. My mom would beat on my dad. I mean, they were very violent, vicious people. And so, but in public and society, if they were someplace where people knew them, they were two totally different people. They were nice and friendly. They brought potato salad to the supper. My mom would bake desserts and cookies. They had friends. But if they were someplace where the people didn't know them, like at a store, like Kmart or someplace, like Walmart today, all holds were all, they were allowed to just do whatever they wanted, and they would fight in the stores. I mean, my parents loved to fight, and they kept it up. They kept it going. They kept that fight up. So 0 to 5, really, the only thing that I saw when I came around finally, after I'm the seventh child born, the last of 7 siblings. My parents moved down to Mexico. All the siblings were very miserable. They left behind Canada and everybody they knew, and down to New Mexico where they didn't know anybody. And my parents didn't know anybody. They just moved to this city where they didn't know anybody. And this family that was not tight knit began to break apart. It was already a mess. My mom was already wanting to divorce my dad before they even moved to the States because he was abusing her and the children. The court said no, there was no infidelity, so have to stay together. So my mother was just felt like she was stuck. Then they went down there to New Mexico, and 5 years after they were there, I was born. My dad had been raping my mother maritally, marital rape, for years. My mother was told not to have any children after my brother, who was 7 years older than me. And 2 babies died. They were born stillborn in between me and my 7-year older brother. One made it, so that's Kathy. My sister was 5 years older than me, and I made it, but just barely because the two of us were very sick when we were born. Kathy was very sick, and myself. And so my mother, she had been tolerating this marital rape, for years, and hating my dad, just loathing my dad. And then I came along, and it was just, I was born out of marital rape. My mother, she at the time she was 38 years old. She had had a long time to sit and stew in her anger and her frustration. It wasn't like she was 20. I mean, she had years to sit and stew about her horrible situation with her own life of abuse, being abused as a child herself, witnessing horrible things in her own family, and then 38 years old, popping out the seventh child born alive from a man who she loathed. She wanted to love him because, he was her husband, but he treated her so horrifically. And this is why I talk a lot about domestic violence and abuse. And, the things that he would do and say to my mother was just horrific. It was just horrible. And no wonder my mother would rebel against him, and she would literally retaliate and fight back. Like, she just got to the point where she was like, I'm not sitting here and just taking this idly. So the two of them just fought and fought and fought and fought. So I came into this mess, born into it. So in the home that I grew up in, which was the first house that I remember living in on La Vida in Albuquerque, New Mexico in 1965, my parents were they were at their height of problems. And, my mother was physically ill, mentally ill as well. My dad was physically strong, but very, very mentally sick and psychologically ill. And, they created this hell for everyone in that house, right? They fought continually at home. They fought constant. They could not be in the same room together without a fight breaking out because my dad would say something, then my mom would say something, and the fight would be on, you know. And it wasn't just to pick against the kids. I mean, they would start out fighting with each other, and then it would escalate down to the kids, just depending on their moods. So it was absolutely horrific. I remember some of my very first memories were just being very afraid, just a lot of fear of what was behind the door. I used to have, at some point, somewhere, one of my earliest sort of recognized memories that I have is lying in a crib, like or some type of a playpen type thing, with the door closed, with some clothes hanging on the back of it, which I believe would have been my mother's clothes just hanging there, and the screaming and the craziness going on outside that door. And I was literally just looking at that door, just afraid of what was behind that door. Well, that was my family out there fighting. Then I remember, oh, a lot of glass breaking, a lot of name calling, screaming, cursing, crying, just yelling, stomping around. People, this is how my parents lived, right? And they created this for us, for their children. And so, it was a horrific situation to come into. I wasn't being cuddled and, oh, look at the little one, and, oh, we got another daughter to add to the rest of our brood. It was none of that. My mother was too emotionally exhausted to look after me. She was physically exhausted. She was physically ill, psychologically ill. And so I just kind of grew up, sort of, you know, hanging around. My mom fed me and stuff, and changed my diapers, which I had to really pay for later. But yeah, it was absolutely horrific situation. I know that by the time I was 2, I'm pretty sure I was 2 years old. My parents had child services get involved. My parents were arrested and brought up on child abuse charges um, because my dad had beaten up my brother. I talk a lot about this on my blog talk shows as well as Spreaker, and it's in my book, detailed in my book. But one of my brothers, Rob, who was the it was Kevin, it was Irene, Kevin, uh, Rob, and Chess. So Rob was the third oldest son, and my dad had it in for him. I don't know. I could tell that even when I was about 5 or 6 years old, by the time I started to really be cognitive, that my dad had this hate on for him. But when I was 2, my parents were brought up on charges because my dad had beaten him up, beaten my brother Rob up. And my brother Rob went to school. My mom put him in a turtleneck, sent him to school. So I was 2, he was 12, about 12 years older than me, 12 and a half, somewhere in there. I'm thinking that's how the age difference. I'm thinking that he would have been 13 or something like that, probably 14 or something, and somewhere in there. And he went to school with a turtleneck on, and he said he was afraid to go home. And the teacher noticed bruises and that he was battered, and they got the police involved. And my parents were arrested and brought up on child abuse charges. They had to go to court, and the courts actually said, if you don't meet these certain requirements, we're going to remove your children until you can get it together because you're just hurting your children. You've got to get help. So they actually assigned them, individual counseling as well as marital counseling, as well as individual counseling for the children, as well as family counseling. And this is what I was told later on by several of my older siblings as well as my mom. And my mom's stuff all matched my siblings' stuff, so I figure, it was all pretty good information. So I was too little. I don't remember going to court or anything like that, or anything of the initial part of it. I do remember social workers coming around to our house and checking for signs of abuse because they'd always give me a sucker, and I'd have to take my clothes off, and they would check my diaper, and they would check to make sure that my mom wasn't abusing me physically or burning me or whatever. I think they were checking for sexual abuse. They were checking for everything. And so I remember that. They came around for a couple of years. And then after they left, during that period of time, they were actually giving my mom tips on what she could do with me to bond, because we never did bond. And my mom actually, during that time, would set up these little tea parties for me. And I remember this. And she would set up like these little luncheons, and I had this little tea set that she bought me. My parents had very little money to work with, and I was very happy to have this, this little tea set. And she would put little bits of cereal there and a little bit of milk or whatever, and we'd have these little tea parties together. And she started doing some things like that with me for a while, which was really nice. And then after the social workers were gone, it all started all over again. The craziness, the fights, the abuse towards the children. And I'm starting to get older, and I'm starting to be able to see how things are working here. You know what I mean? Like, what's this environment that I'm in? It was normal to me, but it was something I had to be very much aware of. You had to be on the ball and on your toes to keep track of who was in what room and who was doing what to who, because the results were often painful for the recipients of whoever was in the room. And I just remember just fighting, a lot of fighting between my parents. I remember a lot of problems between my dad and my brother, who he had this hate on for, my brother Rob. And I remember sitting there in the living room quite often, sitting on, because that's basically where I sat. I was on the couch in the living room and playing with toys or whatever. And my dad, I remember this being about 4 years old, and my dad coming in from church. My mother, every Sunday was real let down at our house because my dad would go to church and he'd put on this white suit and these white shoes and he'd go to church, and while he was at church, it was great because my parents, they weren't together, so they weren't fighting. And then when he would come home, it was like, uh-oh. Because as soon as he would come home, the fight would be on. And he would start talking, you're going to hell to my mother, and you boys, if you don't straighten up, you're going to hell, and you're the devil's seed. This is the kind of stuff he would say. He would say, you're from the devil, from that woman there who's been sleeping with the devil. He would call my mom all kinds of names. He would call her, you know, she was a whore, she was a slut, she was this, she was that. She was sleeping with the neighbors across the street. None of these kids belonged to him. This is what would happen. Like, this is just how we grew up. Like, this is sort of a daily or weekly thing that we listen to, right? And then my mother, of course, would try to stand up for herself, and she would say, well, I'm not sleeping with everyone. This is not the postman's kid. I was the postman's kid. And one of my brothers was the neighbors across the street. He had all of us picked out to who we really belonged to, according to him. My dad was very sick, very mentally ill. And also, I think, possessed with the devil, because I believe there was demon possession there, because he was what people would call it schizophrenia, but my dad was very evil and very evil inclined, and he would see these demons around him trying to get him, always. The demons were always trying to get him, and the devil was always trying to get him. And he would be screaming in his room at night, it's the devil, demons, and all this weird voices and stuff, and I was just like, oh, first it used to scare me, but after a while I was like, oh, it's just dad and his weirdness. And I did feel, sometimes a little bit sad for him, but not always, because he was so evil. And then, during the day, he'd go to work. He was fine. See, my dad worked. He was not a guy to sit around drinking beer at home drunk. My parents, neither one of them drank. They were not alcoholic abusers, right? These people they had friends. My mom eventually got a job later on, and we'll go into detail about that. My dad worked, They knew people. They talked to people. The neighbors liked them. They didn't abuse the neighbors, and they didn't abuse the neighbors' kids. They just abused their own kids. And so, but anyway, 0 to 5, I mean, just a lot of problems. My dad was just, horrible to my mother, claiming that none of us belonged to him. My mother would then start fighting back and saying, you're the devil himself, and all of these kids are from you. And the abuse would just come back from her. Neither one of them really cared about their children at all. In the meantime, my brothers were older. I remember this stuff, especially from 4 on. So, like, let's say I'm 4 years old. My oldest sibling would have been my sister Irene, who was 18 years older than me. She was already moved out with her own kids. My nephews were born shortly after I was. So, her 2 sons. So my nephews and I grew up more like cousins, right? But she was already moved out and gone. She was like, I'm out of here, man. So she was gone, and my other brother was 16 years older than me, and he was gone, right? So there was 2 of the older siblings were out of the house already. And so that left 5 of us children left in the home. So that was my brother Chess, my brother Rob, and my brother Howard, and my sister Kathy and myself. So here's my brothers having to listen to my dad calling my mom a whore and a tramp and sleeping around and with all the neighbors and the postman and that none of us kids belonged to him. And then my brothers would try to stand up for my mom, which they would. And it would always get them a beating. My dad would punch them, he would kick them, he would whip off his belt and beat the shit out of them. And he would throw them in the bedroom and stomp on them. I remember this. This is how I grew up. This was my world growing up. And I didn't like what I saw. I didn't want him hitting my brothers because I love my brothers. They actually paid more attention to me than my mother did. So because my mother was not able to, not she was taxed. I mean, taxed and done with raising kids. And so my brothers would tickle me and play with me a little bit and torture my Barbies and stuff. But I didn't care. I liked the interaction and I liked having somebody pay attention to me because otherwise I was pretty well on my own. And they would stand up for her. They'd get beaten on, slapped around, kicked around. And of course, my mom loved the fact that her sons would stick up for her. My mom loved her boys very much so. People say, well, did she love you? I'm sure she did, but she used to say, I love my boys. She loved her boys. She had a special relationship with her sons. It was a sick and twisted relationship only because it was very codependent. She used them. She used all of us. And I'll go into more detail about that. I actually did a lot of talking about this and I'm uploading all of my stuff here on this Born in Hell website. And I'm actually labeling what it is. So eventually, when that's all done, you'll be able to go through and pick out where I was talking about codependency. And I really went into a lot of detail, family history of what my parents did and how this affected our lives. And how it affects. This is a real example of how damaging this stuff really is. And so I just remember, I tried to stand up for my brothers too. My dad beating on them and kicking them. And I mean, I was 4 years old. I'd be like, don't hit my brother, or don't hit my mother. And then I'd get slapped around. My dad would come over to the couch and he'd grab me by the throat and he'd shake me and he'd slap me and he'd be like, don't you talk to me. Don't you talk back to me. And so, I mean, I'm like, well, now I'm going to get beat if I say anything, So then I'd be crying. Then my mother would be like, you stop crying right now. And then she'd be like, I'll give you something to really cry about. She didn't want to hear no crying, man. You were not allowed to cry. Crying was not allowed, man. You had to just buck up, right? So, you just learn to take it. Learn to take it. What I learned how to do was take it and then give it back. When people say, well, you should never say things like, when I got older to be an older teen, I used to just tell it like it was. I didn't care if they beat me or not. I was like, I don't care. I'm saying it. You're going to beat me anyway. I'm just going to tell you what I think. And I mean, horrific situation. No child deserves that. No, I don't care. No child deserves to grow up like that. So I just remember growing up in a lot of fear. I started school when I was very young, at the advice of the Child Protection Services. They said get her into school because she needs to be interacting with some normal things, normal different people, non-abusive environment, right, healthy type stuff, right. So I started school when I was young. I think I started when I was 4 or 5. I was very young. I was about at least a year and a bit younger. That's why I graduated when I was 16, because I was almost 2 years in before everybody else. So I started first grade. Instead of going to kindergarten, I went from hell to school. I had no idea what to make of that, because I was like, oh, there's rules here and people have to behave a certain way. And I don't know how to do any of that. And I mean, I don't even know how to participate in anything without crying or getting hurt. If my teacher talked to me, I thought that I was in trouble, you know. Even if my teacher just talked to me, I'd be freaking out. I'd be like, I'm going to be in trouble. Someone's going to hit me. That's just what came into my mind. That's what was going on at my house. The teacher then couldn't deal with me because I was crying all the time in the class and put me in a special ed class for kids that couldn't quite get into the whole beginning of the first year or two of school. So I got put into a special class with this other teacher, which I'm really glad that I did because she was very nurturing. She was very kind. I was in the class with the kids that fall off the desk and hit their heads on the floor, right? it was a good class for me to be in because I needed to be in a class where there wasn't that pressure, and I was able to, they were able to be kind to me, So I remember that teacher, Mrs. Norris. I'll never forget her. And just by her saying kind things and nice things to me really helped me out because I started to mellow out and I started to realize that school isn't a bad place. I'm not necessarily going to get hurt here like I'm getting hurt at home. And, people aren't going to necessarily hit me because I say something or if I start crying or whatever. Because if I start crying, then I'd get a beating at home. So if I started crying at school, I was expecting a beating. Horrific, horrific stuff for a kid to have to grow up in. This is my foundational years. So not only were my parents fighting and physically beating the shit out of each other while I was in the womb, they just brought me into the world and said, welcome to our hell. Welcome to our nightmare. And that's why I titled this show Born in Hell. So that's pretty well, I think, really what I'll finish off here with this one. And we'll pick up on another one. I'm going to kind of go in progression. This was like 0 to 4. Yeah, 0 to 5, 0 to 4 really. And we'll pick up like 5 to 6. And I'll be able to give you a little bit of a bird's eye view about that. This is a lot of it detailed in A Life of Death Redemption. And some in La Vida Jubies, but that's more the teen years. Obviously, I did a lot of it's the teen years. And then one child abuse survivor to another. The journey is the sexual abuse that I suffered at the age of 8 years old. But that's me as an adult going back and looking at my healing journey and then allowing myself to deal with what I've had to deal with to overcome child sexual abuse, right? Spiritually, emotionally, psychologically, allowing myself to heal, right? And so what I wanted to do was basically run through more A Life of Death Redemption, what's in that book, and just so that people will have a better idea of why I titled this Born in Hell and why child abuse has got to stop and why sometimes people say, well, we don't see any signs of abuse. Abuse is not just bruises and welts and cuts and burns and stuff that you can see. The real damage is what happens to the person's heart, the person's psyche, and the way that person thinks. Their mind, their will, their emotions, their whole being is affected by it, right? And that's the scarring that really is hard to deal with because that is what forms a person. That's what makes a person up. It's like who I am. Right? And so, that's why I wanted to title this Born in Hell, because it really was a life of hell. And we need to, first of all, help survivors to get help. If you're a survivor, you do not allow yourself to be destroyed by your past. You've got to win this fight. You've got to win. You've got to stay alive, and you've got to get yourself to a better place, and you have to be responsible for it. No one's going to do it for you. You have to want to make those choices, the right choices, to get help. Find the help that you need, whether it's anonymous or whatever. Get the support. Get on a healing journey. Get going and stay alive and win this fight with me. And for all these advocates out here who are fighting against child abuse, keep speaking up. Keep raising your voice, because the abuser world wants this shut down. Nobody wants to deal with this stuff. But kids are dying, and those of us who have lived and have a voice, and those of us who are willing to speak out about this stuff, need to keep on raising our voices so we can stop this crazy mess. So we'll talk to you all real soon. Until the next time, and I say, you know what, just take care. God bless you all, and I look forward to being with you again. Bye-bye.